A routine ocean expedition turned into a shocking discovery when the captain lifted a mysterious container from the bottom of the sea. But as soon as the doors were opened, everyone froze in disbelief at what was inside. Subscribe to the channel and right where you're watching this video from. The humid air of the West African coastline hung heavy over the harbor, carrying with it the briny tang of salt water and the distant rhythmic boom of waves breaking on the outer reefs. From the balcony of the research center's main building, Captain Marcus Hale stood with his arms crossed, watching the early morning light spill across the water like molten gold. His skin, weathered by decades of sun and wind, held the deep tone of someone who had spent more years at sea than on land. Behind his calm eyes lay a history written in storms, in rescues, in nights spent navigating through black water where one wrong calculation could mean disaster. He had been a merchant marine officer in his youth, a naval search and rescue captain through his prime, and now at 40, he served as both captain and lead oceanographer for the Coastal Research Division. Marcus was a man of routine, his days often unfolding with predictable precision. He rose before the sun, checked the weather and tide reports, reviewed the previous day's data logs, and then set about planning the next operation. But this morning was different. Something in the air, a faint hum of urgency, had interrupted the normal rhythm of the harbor. The center's communications room had sent for him less than an hour ago, their message terse: "You need to see this." Inside the lab, a dim light glowed from the wall-sized monitor displaying a grid of oceanic sensor data. Streams of numbers scrolled rapidly, interspersed with flashing red alerts. One of the younger technicians, a wiry man in a faded blue shirt, looked up as Marcus entered. "Captain, we've had an anomaly," he said, voice low but charged. Marcus stepped forward, eyes narrowing at the jagged spikes in the data feed. These weren't the patterns of drifting currents or migrating fish. This was something abrupt, forceful. The technician enlarged one section of the graph, highlighting a series of deep tremors recorded by a buoy 25 kilometers offshore. "The readings came in around 2:30 this morning," the technician explained. "A sharp drop in local water pressure, then 3 separate impact signatures. Depth is 80 meters. Source is stationary now, but whatever it was, it hit hard." Marcus leaned closer, tracing the curve of the graph with his finger. "That's no landslide," he murmured. His mind moved quickly through possibilities. A sunken trawler? A collapsed reef? The numbers didn't fit either. The impacts were too concentrated, too localized, and the mass estimate, it was big. Heavy enough to push a surge of displaced water all the way to the buoys. He gestured to the adjacent terminal. "What do we have on surface vessel traffic in that area in the last 48 hours? The technician keyed in a command, and a satellite overlay appeared, showing the shipping lanes like faint blue veins across the sea. Marcus's eyes caught on a single blip that had cut across the region yesterday, an unflagged cargo vessel, no name in the registry, transponder active only intermittently. It had slowed near the coordinates, then moved on. By midnight, it was gone. The memory stirred something in him. Ghost ships weren't a myth, at least not to men who'd been long enough at sea. There were vessels that slipped between jurisdictions, ships of convenience that flew no flag and answered to no port. He had seen the aftermath of such operations: illegal dumping, arms running, sometimes worse. And the pattern here, the deliberate course change into shallow waters, set off every instinct he had. The research director, a small, precise woman named Dr. Fadumo Ibrahim, joined them, her expression grave. "We have to verify what's down there. If this is hazardous material, we can't leave it." Her voice softened. "I want you on it, Marcus. You've handled this kind of operation before." He felt the old pull, that mix of duty and curiosity. He'd once promised himself he'd never again take on missions that smelled of danger for danger's sake. But this wasn't about thrill or risk. It was about the sea, about the unknown thing sitting on her floor, perhaps waiting to poison or trap or conceal. He nodded once. "We'll go." Preparations began at once. In the vessel bay, his ship, the Umkonto, waited at her berth. Her white hull streaked from the last expedition, but her deck immaculate. She was a modern research craft, fitted with a reinforced crane for heavy recovery, a pair of deep-diving drones with mechanical arms, side-scan sonar, and a compact lab below deck. Marcus moved among the crew as they readied her, his presence steadying them, checking over lashings, verifying the pressure seals on the drone compartments. Every piece of equipment had to be operational. A single failure at depth could ruin the mission. His team assembled. Leon Mba, the drone technician whose quiet precision made him indispensable. Celine Dumba, the navigator with a gift for reading both charts and the moods of the sea. Dr. Aisha Cohn, the medic and marine biologist whose keen eye missed nothing, and John Mbayo, the engineer who could coax life back into a stalled engine or a frozen hydraulic arm with equal skill. They were seasoned, each in their own way, and Marcus trusted them. The deckhands loaded crates of sonar buoys, extra fuel drums, and the specialized lifting strops they would need if the object was as large as the data suggested. In the cramped galley, Aisha stocked medical kits alongside samples jars and portable spectrometers. The air on deck was alive with the smells of oil, salt, and fresh rope. By midday, the Umkonto eased away from the dock. Marcus took the wheel for the first leg, feeling the familiar vibration through the deck plates as the twin diesels pushed her into open water. The coastline fell away behind them, the low green hills blurring into the heat haze. Above, the sky was a flawless, relentless blue. The sea had its moods, and as they pushed farther out, it shifted. The swells lengthened, the water deepened in hue from turquoise to a dark, metallic blue that seemed to drink in the sunlight. Spray flew up over the bow, misting their faces, and the wind carried the scent of something older, wilder, as if they were leaving behind the safe, charted world. Marcus stood at the wheel, his mind on the coordinates glowing on the GPS display. Whatever waited there had been sitting for hours, unmoving, on the seabed. The hum of the engines and the creak of the hull were the only sounds for long stretches, broken now and then by Leon reporting on sonar contacts. "Nothing but open bottom so far," he said at one point, glancing up from his screen. "No wrecks on the charts here. This area's usually dead quiet." Marcus nodded but said nothing. He kept his eyes on the horizon, where the line between sea and sky seemed sharper than usual, as if marking a boundary not meant to be crossed. In his gut, there was that same tautness he'd felt before rescue missions, that sense that somewhere ahead, something was waiting. By late afternoon, the swell began to ease, and the GPS counted down the final kilometers to the anomaly's location. Marcus could feel the shift in the crew, voices quieter, movements more deliberate, each man and woman knowing they were about to meet whatever had sent those tremors racing to the shore. He eased back the throttles, the Umkonto settling into a slow glide over the coordinates. Celine checked the depth finder. 80 meters, flat bottom. She glanced at him, her brow furrowed. "It's right below us." Marcus stepped out onto the deck, the wind tugging at his jacket. The water here was darker still, with an odd slickness to its surface, a subtle distortion in the reflections. He thought of the nameless cargo ship passing through in the night, of the sudden impacts recorded in the early hours. He turned back toward the wheelhouse, his decision already made. "Let's send the drone," he said. And as Leon and John moved to ready the Neptune, the crew fell into the familiar choreography of deep water work. Hydraulic pumps whined to life, cables snaked across the deck, and the drone's camera feed flickered onto the main monitor. Marcus watched as the mechanical sphere, bristling with lights and arms, slipped beneath the surface and began its descent into the shadowed blue. The water closed over it with barely a ripple, as if swallowing a secret. Somewhere below, on the cold floor of the ocean, the answer was waiting. The hum of the hydraulic pumps and the steady slap of the waves against the hull created a rhythm that seemed to slow time as Marcus watched the Neptune sink deeper into the cold, lightless water. On the monitor, the world faded from brilliant blues into dark green, then finally into a dense blackness broken only by the drone's powerful LED beams. Tiny marine snow, particles of organic matter, drifted past in endless procession, catching the light and giving the impression of a gentle snowfall in slow motion. Somewhere down there, beyond the curtain of darkness, lay the object that had sent a shudder through the sea. Leon sat hunched over the control console, his fingers working the joysticks with delicate precision. He had been piloting underwater drones for years, and Marcus trusted his instincts as much as his own. John stood behind him, eyes glued to the depth gauge as the numbers ticked steadily toward 80 meters. Celine leaned in from the side, her lips pressed into a thin line as she scanned the sonar feed for any unexpected contacts. They were all silent, their focus drawn completely into the flickering image on the monitor. At 70 meters, the beams began to illuminate the contour of the seabed. The bottom here was a plain of fine sand and silt, interrupted only by occasional rocky outcrops. The drone hovered just above the floor, its lights cutting across the emptiness. For a few moments, there was nothing but the void and the sound of the thrusters pushing the little craft forward. Then, slowly, a shape began to emerge from the gloom. At first, it was just a darker patch against the pale sand, but as Leon adjusted the angle of approach, the silhouette sharpened into straight lines and defined edges. Marcus leaned forward, his pulse quickening. It was a container. A full-sized 12-meter shipping container, resting perfectly level on the sand as though placed there by careful hands rather than the chaos of the sea. Its sides were encrusted with mussels and barnacles, and strands of seaweed swayed gently from its corners. Yet, even through the layers of marine growth, the metal beneath appeared strangely intact. No jagged rust patches, no ruptures from impact, just the stubborn geometry of something built to endure. Leon maneuvered the drone closer, the camera panning across the side of the container. Instead of the usual stenciled identification codes and shipping line logos, the metal bore faint engravings, geometric patterns, a sequence of interlocking arcs and lines unlike any industrial markings Marcus had ever seen. Time and salt water had softened their edges, but the designs still caught the drone's light in peculiar ways, glinting as if the grooves were filled with a different material. John exhaled sharply behind him. "That's not standard issue, not even close." Marcus didn't answer. He was already thinking ahead, considering the weight calculations, the possibility of booby traps, the logistics of bringing it up without damaging whatever might be inside. Objects this large and this intact didn't just fall into the ocean without someone noticing, and certainly not ones sealed so thoroughly. Leon brought the drone around to inspect the locking mechanisms. The doors were shut tight, held by two massive clasps that looked newer than the rest of the container. There were no signs of corrosion on the hinges, no marine life growing directly on the seals, as though they had been treated with something to resist both rust and intrusion. The container was watertight. Marcus could tell just by the clean lines of the gasket and the way the doors sat flush against the frame. It was designed not to let a single drop inside. They completed a slow circuit of the container, confirming its position on the seabed and checking for obstacles. The surrounding sand was undisturbed. No gouges or trenches leading to it, no drag marks from the currents. It had been dropped here from above, straight down, and it had landed without tumbling. The precision of it was unsettling. Marcus straightened and turned toward the deck crew, who were waiting for his signal. "We're bringing it up," he said. There was no hesitation in his voice, though inside his mind was racing. If this was what he suspected, something placed deliberately, maybe to hide, maybe to preserve, then it could be dangerous to open at sea. But leaving it here without answers wasn't an option. John and Leon worked together to guide the drone into position, attaching the first lifting straps around the container's corners. The thick synthetic straps unfurled in the water like ribbons, then tightened as the mechanical claws cinched them into place. The Neptune's arms moved with deliberate slowness. One wrong twist could tear the fabric or slip it from the smooth surface. On deck, the crew activated the main crane. The heavy cable unspooled with a low metallic rumble, its hook disappearing into the depths. Minutes later, the drone's camera caught sight of it descending through the black water like a silver spider dropping from its web. Leon guided the hook into place, securing it to the central lift point on the strops. Once the connection was double-checked, the signal came up to the deck. The engines of the crane roared and the cable drew taut. At first, nothing happened. The container seemed fused to the seafloor, refusing to budge. Marcus felt the vibration through the deck as the crane strained, its steel frame groaning under the weight. John muttered something under his breath, recalculating the load. They were lifting far more than a typical cargo container should weigh, even if it were full. The extra tonnage made Marcus uneasy. What could be inside that would make it this heavy? "More ballast on the starboard," Marcus called out. The deckhands scrambled, adjusting the ship's counterweights to keep her from listing under the strain. Slowly, centimeter by centimeter, the container began to rise from its sandy bed. Clouds of silt billowed upward, swirling in the drone's lights, reducing visibility to almost nothing. Leon pulled the Neptune back to avoid being engulfed, but the monitors still showed the faint shadow of the container lifting clear. It was a long, punishing process. The hydraulic systems hissed and groaned, the steel cables sang under tension, and every pair of eyes on deck was fixed on the spot where the surface would break. Marcus stood with his hands on the railing, his jaw set, the spray from the waves stinging his face. This was the moment that would decide the rest of the mission. He could feel it. At last, the first dark corner of the container broke the surface, trailing streams of seawater. More of it emerged, barnacle-encrusted steel glistening in the sunlight. The strops held firm, and the crane lifted the load high enough for the deckhands to swing it inboard. With a heavy, resonant thud, the container settled onto the reinforced recovery platform, sending a shiver through the deck plates. Up close, it was even more imposing. The engraved symbols were clearer now, strange curves and intersecting lines that seemed almost decorative, though their purpose was unknowable. The marine growth clung to it like a living shroud, But beneath that, the steel skin looked untouched by the corrosive bite of salt. Marcus ran his hand along the side, feeling the coolness of the metal, the faint ridges of the designs. The locks gleamed faintly, their surfaces unpitted by rust. Around him, the crew gathered, their expressions a mixture of awe and unease. In the stillness that followed the clamor of the recovery, Marcus could hear the water dripping from the container onto the deck, each drop loud in the sudden quiet. They had pulled something from the bottom that did not belong to the ordinary world of sunken freight and discarded machinery. Something was inside, something sealed away with great care. He stepped back, letting his eyes travel across the container from end to end. Whatever lay behind those doors had been meant to stay hidden. He could feel it in the weight of the thing, in the precision of its placement, in the unbroken seals that had resisted the sea for who knew how long. And now it was here, on his deck, under the open sky. The decision of what to do next would come soon enough, but Marcus knew the course was set. The mission had changed. They were no longer simply investigating an anomaly. They were in possession of a mystery. And mysteries at sea, he had learned long ago, were rarely harmless. The container sat like a silent monolith on the reinforced deck, its dripping flanks steaming faintly in the afternoon sun. Every creak of the ship seemed amplified in the pause that followed its recovery, as though the vessel itself were waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus stood a few paces back from it, arms folded, his eyes tracing the engraved symbols again and again, searching for any hint of their meaning. The patterns caught the light oddly, as if the grooves had been cut not just for identification, but for a purpose. Functional or ceremonial, he couldn't tell. Around him, the crew kept a cautious distance, their earlier adrenaline from the lift now giving way to a prickling wariness. He could feel the tension in their movements. No one wanted to be the first to approach too close without instruction, and even Leon, who normally could not resist getting hands-on with new finds, hovered near his control console as if the container might shift on its own. Marcus finally broke the standoff with a nod to John, who stepped forward carrying a handheld scanner. The engineer moved slowly, sweeping the device across the surface from top to bottom. Its screen flickered with readouts. Radiation negligible. No signs of volatile chemical emissions, no detectable heat signatures. When he ran the probe along the doors, the scanner chirped twice, registering a slight temperature drop compared to the outer hull. Marcus noted it, but said nothing. The reading wasn't alarming, just unusual. Aisha emerged from below deck with a compact environmental testing kit slung over her shoulder. She knelt beside the base of the doors, inserting a slim sensor rod between the seal and the deck plating. The miniature pump whirred softly as it drew in a trace of the trapped air, feeding it into the kit's analyzer. The result came back clean. No toxins, no abnormal oxygen levels, nothing that might signal an immediate biological hazard. She glanced up at Marcus, giving a slight shake of her head. "It's safe to open as far as we can tell," she said, though the careful tone of her voice betrayed her own uncertainty. Marcus stepped closer, examining the locking mechanisms. The metal of the clasps was dull, almost pewter-like, with none of the pitting or corrosion he expected after time underwater. He brushed his fingertips along the seam where door met frame and felt the perfect alignment of the gasket. Still supple, still unbroken. Whoever had sealed this container had done so with the intention of keeping the inside preserved, not just protected from the elements. He recognized the craftsmanship. This wasn't standard cargo work. This was custom, deliberate, perhaps even secretive. The crew assembled the necessary tools: a set of industrial pry bars, a hydraulic jack, and a small kit of precision picks in case the locks required more finesse. Marcus decided on the latter first. No sense in damaging the mechanism if it could be opened cleanly. Leon knelt by the primary clasp, adjusting the picks to match its unusual geometry. It took longer than expected. The internals were not like any shipping lock Leon had ever encountered, but with a soft metallic click, the first clasp released. A second followed, and then the central locking rod could be pulled free. The sound of the seal breaking was low but distinct, a kind of inward sigh, as if the container itself were relieved to breathe again. A faint draft escaped as the doors were eased open. Cool, dry air, carrying with it a scent that was hard to place. It wasn't the briny rot of the sea, nor the mildew of damp storage, but something closer to the stale quiet of an abandoned room that had been sealed for years. The first sliver of the interior appeared in the gap, a muted wash of color in the drone lights, a hint of fabric, the flat surface of wood. Marcus signaled for the doors to be opened wider. As they swung back on their heavy hinges, the reveal was complete. Inside was not a cargo hold filled with crates or machinery, but a room, compact yet unmistakably domestic. A bed was bolted against the far wall, neatly made with a faded quilt. A narrow couch stood opposite, upholstered in a patterned fabric dulled by time. Between them sat a small table with 2 chairs, each leg fixed to the floor with metal brackets. A shallow shelf ran along one wall, holding an assortment of books in various languages, their spines worn but intact. Against another wall, a cupboard stood closed, its doors latched. The strangeness of it pressed in on everyone at once. This was not the makeshift bunkroom of a sailor improvising a home aboard a ship. This was a space intentionally designed to be lived in for long periods, even in isolation. Aisha stepped inside first, her boots thudding softly against the wooden floorboards that had been fitted over the steel. She reached for the quilt, brushing her fingers over the stitching. It was handmade, perhaps by someone with time and care enough to work in small, deliberate patterns. Beside the bed sat a simple nightstand with a drawer. Inside lay a dog-eared paperback novel, a pair of reading glasses, and a small battery-powered lantern. John followed, moving to inspect the fixtures. Everything was fastened down. Not just the furniture, but the bookshelves, the tableware in the cupboard, even a small ceramic mug by the sink, held in place by a ring of metal bolted to the counter. It was as if the entire space had been prepared for constant movement, the way one might design a cabin on a vessel expecting rough seas. Yet, the craftsmanship was far too fine for the cramped, utilitarian quarters found on most ships. Marcus stepped over the threshold, taking in the atmosphere. The air inside was cool and dry, with a faint undertone of something metallic, perhaps from the sealed walls themselves. His eyes roamed over every detail, the way the floorboards fit snugly against the steel frame, the faint scuffs on the table's surface, the slight indentation in the couch's cushions. It felt lived in, yet untouched for some time. He imagined the container on the seafloor, this room intact inside it, waiting silently in the dark. He turned toward the shelf of books and began scanning the titles. Many were on marine biology, oceanography, and geology. Others were novels in French, English, and a language he didn't immediately recognize. One volume caught his eye, a weathered logbook with no title on the spine. When he pulled it free and flipped it open, he found sketches of wave patterns, sonar readings, and notes written in a tight, slanted hand. Much of it was technical, but here and there were entries that hinted at something else. Unexplained activity near the trench, and hold position until we can verify readings. The dates stopped abruptly mid-year. Aisha was crouched near the table, examining a sealed plastic case tucked beneath it. She looked up when Marcus approached. "Scientific instruments," she said after opening it. Inside were a set of hydrophones, a portable water analyzer, and several small vials filled with samples, each labeled with coordinates. The handwriting matched that in the logbook. Marcus took one of the vials, holding it to the light. The liquid inside was pale and faintly iridescent. Leon, who had been examining the cupboard, called them over. Behind a row of neatly stacked tins of preserved food, he had found a small compartment with a sliding panel. Inside was an old-fashioned radio transceiver, its knobs and dials worn smooth from use. It was disconnected from any power source, but a coiled antenna lay beside it. Next to the transceiver sat a bundle of papers secured with a rubber band. Marcus slipped the bundle free, leafing through them. They were maps, detailed bathymetric charts of the surrounding seafloor, with certain areas shaded in red and marked with a single word in the block letters, "Danger." The discovery deepened the mystery rather than solved it. Who had lived here, and why had they been stationed in a container like this? Why had they been studying these particular waters? And what had happened to them that left this place sealed and abandoned on the ocean floor? Marcus stepped back out onto the deck, the sunlight momentarily blinding after the dim interior. The container loomed behind him, its open doors spilling the strange domestic scene into the open air. He felt the weight of the unanswered questions pressing in, but there was no denying the pull to learn more. Somewhere in this web of carefully arranged possessions, scientific instruments, and cryptic notes lay the key to the container's journey. And, if his instincts were right, the story would not end with what they had just found. It was only beginning. The sun had shifted westward by the time Marcus stepped back into the container, casting a warm, slanting light across the deck and into the strange little room. That late afternoon glow deepened the colors inside, bringing out the muted reds of the quilt and the gold flecks in the wooden floorboards. It was almost homely in that moment, almost comfortable, until his eyes caught again on the empty couch, the untouched table, the perfectly aligned objects that suggested a life interrupted rather than ended. The air was still cool and dry, holding a silence that felt too deliberate to be natural, as though the room had been waiting for them, preserved like an exhibit in a museum. Aisha was still moving methodically from corner to corner, her gloved hands opening drawers, testing latches, noting each object's condition. She worked without speaking, the faint creak of hinges and the soft scrape of metal on wood the only sounds. On a low shelf near the bed, she uncovered a row of small personal items. A folded scarf, a brass compass worn smooth with use, and a weathered notebook bound in leather. Marcus joined her as she opened it. The pages were filled with neat, lupin handwriting in French, interspersed with quick sketches, crude maps, outlines of wave patterns, and tiny diagrams of what looked like seabed structures. In the margins, scattered phrases stood out. Light without source. Patterns repeat every 21 hours. Do not approach during shift. None of it was explained in the text, as if the writer had assumed the context would be obvious to themselves and those who shared the space. On the nightstand beside the bed, Celine had found 3 framed photographs. The first showed a man in his late 40s, dark-skinned and broad-shouldered, wearing work clothes and standing on a dock with cranes and cargo ships in the background. The second was of a woman in a flowing white dress, smiling at someone just out of frame. The third captured two children, a boy and a girl, sitting on a seawall, their legs dangling over the side, the ocean stretching behind them in endless blue. Marcus picked them up one by one, studying the faces. There was no dust under the glass, no fading from sunlight. These had been kept carefully, even in a place where sunlight could never reach. The discoveries felt less like clues and more like the presence of ghosts. Every object was a whisper of someone's routine. The small ceramic dish with a scattering of coins, the sweater draped neatly over the back of a chair, the half-used bar of soap in the bathroom alcove. This container had not been an improvised shelter. It had been a home. John's voice broke the stillness from across the room. "Captain, you need to see this." He was kneeling near the far corner, one hand braced against the floor. Marcus crossed over, crouching beside him. The wooden floorboards here didn't sit quite flush with the metal frame beneath. John ran his fingers along the seam until they caught on a barely perceptible gap. With a twist of his wrist, he pried up a narrow plank, revealing a recessed compartment no more than a few inches deep. Inside lay a black, rectangular device about the size of a hardback book, sealed in a transparent polymer case. A small green indicator light blinked faintly from its surface. Marcus lifted it out carefully. The casing was smooth and airtight, with a charging port on one side. It was lighter than he expected. Leon, now standing close, recognized it at once as a data recorder, an older model but durable and built for field conditions. The green light suggested the internal battery still held a charge. "If this thing has logs," Leon said quietly, "we might get answers." They carried it to the ship's lab, setting it on a padded bench. Leon connected it to a universal adapter, and after a moment, the small speaker on its side crackled. Then, against the hush of the lab, a man's voice began to play, slightly distorted but unmistakably human, speaking in accented English. "My name is Dr. Elias Nguema," the voice said. "If you are hearing this, it means you have found our station. Please, I beg you, do not stop here. There are others, and they are still out there." There was a pause, and in the background came the murmur of another voice, too faint to make out. Elias spoke again, more urgently now. "We were taken from our vessel 2 years ago. We were told we would continue our work, but we have been prisoners. They move us between locations, always by night. They make us monitor the sea floor. They do not say why." The recording clicked and hissed, then resumed. "This container was our shelter and our prison. We were dropped at coordinates you may have already discovered. If it has been recovered, then perhaps—" His voice trailed off. The final words came in a rush, low and hoarse. "They will not let us leave. They will silence us. Find the ship. It will not remain long in one place." The playback ended abruptly, leaving only the faint hum of the adapter. No one spoke for a moment. Marcus felt the weight of the voice settle in his chest. Elias Nguema, he assumed this was the man in the photograph, had been a scientist like himself, working in these waters. And someone had not only confined him, but used his expertise for purposes still unknown. Back in the container, Marcus resumed his inspection with renewed focus. In the cupboard where Leon had found the transceiver, he uncovered a stack of charts. They were hand-marked with concentric rings radiating from certain points on the map, almost like sonar pings. Several were clustered around an area farther offshore, where the depth dropped sharply into a deep trench. Beside one cluster, a note in French read simply, "Source." Aisha reappeared from the narrow bathroom space, holding up a tin box. Inside were folded sheets of paper, each covered in what looked like detailed observation logs. The handwriting matched the notebook, and the entries chronicled weeks of measurements, water temperature fluctuations, unusual sound patterns recorded at depth, and recurring references to surface activity with no explanation of what it meant. The final entry was dated nearly 18 months ago. The more they uncovered, the clearer it became that this container had not been abandoned casually. The people here had been moved, and in a hurry, leaving behind only what could not be carried or what they intended someone else to find. The recorder's placement in the hidden floor compartment suggested foresight. Elias must have known there was a chance, however slim, that the container might be recovered one day. Marcus stood in the doorway, looking out toward the horizon where the sea met the sky. The stillness out there was deceptive. Somewhere beyond sight, a ship was moving. A ship that had taken people like Elias and hidden them away. The clues in this room were fragments of a larger truth, but they were enough to give him a direction. He glanced back at the books, the photographs, the careful arrangement of a life lived under lock and key. There was no mistaking it now. The mission was no longer just about a recovered anomaly. It was about finding the missing and uncovering the reason they had been taken in the first place. The container swayed slightly with the ship's motion, a reminder that they were still at sea, still vulnerable. Marcus felt the shift in his own stance, the move from curiosity to resolve. They had evidence, they had a voice from the past, and they had a lead. The question now was how to follow it without ending up as captives themselves. The voice of Dr. Elias Nguema still echoed in Marcus's mind long after the recorder had fallen silent. It clung to him like the salt in the air, impossible to shake off. Even as the container was secured on deck for the return journey to port, he knew they were not going back, not yet. There was too much here to leave unresolved, too many questions gnawing at him with every passing hour. The photographs of the family, the meticulous notes, the marked maps pointing to the trench offshore, and above all the urgency in Elias's words formed a chain of evidence that pulled Marcus toward a single conclusion. The ship Elias spoke of was still somewhere nearby. If they moved quickly, there was a chance to find it. In the small hours before dawn, Marcus sat alone in the Umkonto's wheelhouse, the glow of the navigation screens casting his face in green and amber light. Celine had spread the maps from the container across the chart table, weighting the corners with mugs of cold coffee. They had spent hours cross-referencing Elias's markings with official hydrographic charts, narrowing the possibilities until only one area stood out: a stretch of open water along the edge of the trench, some 80 nautical miles from their current position. It was remote enough to avoid casual traffic, yet not so far from shore that a ship could not resupply if it had the right contacts. According to Celine's research through maritime tracking databases, one vessel had been sighted in that general area multiple times in the last 6 months, a large container carrier with no registry, operating under various false transponder codes. Each time it appeared, it stayed no longer than a day before vanishing again. Marcus leaned over the table, tapping a point on the chart with his finger. "If this is where they operate," he said quietly, "they've got a reason for coming back. We need to be there before they move on again." His tone was calm but edged with a determination the others had learned not to question. Leon, who had been listening from the corner while running a systems check on the drones, looked up. We're not going to get any official clearance for this, you know that, right? The Coast Guard's going to want to run this through about 5 committees. Marcus met his gaze evenly. By the time they're done, that ship will be halfway to another hemisphere. They began preparing before the sun rose. Leon went over the drone's hydraulics and battery packs, making sure every arm and camera was functioning perfectly. John inspected the crane, re-greasing the cable spools and checking the ballast systems for any weakness. Aisha replenished the medical supplies, adding extra emergency kits in case they encountered survivors in need of immediate care. Celine plotted a course that would take them to the suspected zone under the guise of a marine life survey, filing the paperwork through channels that wouldn't draw unwanted attention. The Umkhonto could pass for a research vessel, and its equipment made the cover story plausible. If anyone challenged them, they would say they were monitoring the migration patterns of tuna along the trench's edge. By mid-morning, the ship was underway again, leaving the coordinates of the recovered container behind. The sea was calm at first, the horizon a clean line of silver light. Marcus stood at the bow for a while, scanning the expanse ahead, feeling the familiar tension coil tighter with each mile. He had chased targets before: pirate skiffs, smugglers, even storm systems when lives depended on it. But this was different. Somewhere out there was a vessel that had turned scientists into prisoners and used them for purposes still hidden from view. And now, with Elias's message in hand, Marcus knew they were close enough to smell the trail. In the afternoon, Celine intercepted a weak transponder ping on the secondary receiver. It was a commercial identifier assigned to a vessel named Altha, a cargo ship registered in Belize. But a quick check showed that the real Altha had been in port in South America for over 2 weeks. This was an imposter. The signal was faint and erratic, likely intentional, but it placed the ship less than 50 nautical miles ahead and moving slowly along the trench's boundary. "They're not in a hurry," Celine observed, frowning, "which means they don't think anyone's looking for them." Marcus considered this. "Or they're waiting for something," he replied. He ordered the Umkhonto's speed increased, but not so much as to attract attention on radar. They would approach from the southeast, where the rising afternoon glare on the water would make them harder to spot visually. The idea was to get close enough to confirm the vessel's identity without alerting its crew. If they were spotted too soon, the other ship might simply steam away into the open ocean, vanishing again for months. As the sun dipped lower, painting the waves in streaks of gold and crimson, a dark smudge appeared on the horizon. Celine confirmed it on radar: the imposter Altha. Marcus studied the silhouette through binoculars. Even at this distance, the lines of the hull and the arrangement of containers were unusual. The stacks on deck were uneven, with gaps in the pattern where containers should have been, possibly to conceal modified units like the one they had recovered. He could see no flag flying from the mast, only a battered radar array spinning slowly. They held their distance through the evening, matching the larger ship's speed while staying just beyond the range at which they might be scrutinized too closely. In the wheelhouse, the crew spoke little, each aware that the next decisions would determine whether they uncovered the truth or were left chasing shadows again. The plan Marcus had settled on was risky but necessary. They would request to come alongside under the pretense of conducting a cooperative survey, offering to share data on fish migration. It was the kind of dull scientific interaction that might pass without suspicion, especially if handled with the right mix of formality and harmlessness. After nightfall, the Umkonto maintained a parallel course, lights dimmed, her wake lost in the swell. Marcus took the opportunity to review the details once more with his team. Celine and Leon would stay aboard to monitor communications and keep the ship ready for quick maneuvering. Marcus himself, along with John and Aisha, would board the larger vessel if granted permission. The goal was to verify whether anyone was being held there and, if possible, make contact with Elias or any other captive scientists. If resistance was encountered, they would withdraw and relay the coordinates to Allied contacts in the Coast Guard who Marcus had discreetly alerted before leaving port. The night passed slowly, each hour marked by the steady heartbeat of the engines and the low hiss of the waves. At first light, Marcus took position at the radio and hailed the other ship. His voice was professional, clipped, offering greetings from a regional marine biology project and requesting temporary boarding rights to take acoustic readings near the trench. There was a long pause before a reply came, the voice on the other end gruff and wary. The captain of the Althea asked pointed questions, too many for a routine exchange, and Marcus answered each with the calm patience of a man used to bureaucracy. Finally, there was a reluctant assent. 1 hour, the voice said, no more. The moment the channel closed, Marcus exhaled, attention leaving him only partially. Getting aboard was the first step, but it also meant entering their den on the crew's terms. On deck, John readied the launch while Aisha gathered her med kit, tucking the recorder from Elias into an inside pocket, as if its presence might lend them strength. Marcus scanned the horizon once more before stepping into the waiting boat. The larger vessel loomed ahead now, its sides streaked with rust and its stacks of containers rising like walls. Somewhere inside that steel labyrinth, the answers waited, and perhaps the missing scientists themselves. As the Umkonto's launch cut through the water toward the massive hull, Marcus felt the weight of the moment settle over him fully. They were no longer simply researchers or rescuers. They were stepping into a game whose rules were written by unseen hands, where one wrong move could end with them joining the very people they hoped to save. He tightened his grip on the gunwale and kept his eyes on the rope ladder being lowered from above, the first tangible link between their search and the truth that had eluded them until now. The launch slapped hard against the swells as it closed the final stretch to the lumen hull of the imposter Althea. From below, the ship seemed even more massive, its rust-streaked sides rising sheer from the water like the wall of a fortress. The rope ladder dangled from a midship's access point, swaying with the slow roll of the vessel. Above, shadowed figures leaned over the railing, their outlines sharp against the pale morning sky. Marcus could feel their eyes on him, assessing, measuring, deciding whether to see him as a nuisance or a threat. He steadied the small boat against the ladder, gesturing for Aisha to go first. She climbed with the practiced efficiency of someone used to boarding from the sea, her movements quick but controlled. John followed, his broad shoulders making the climb awkward but steady. Marcus went last, feeling the coarse fibers of the rope under his palms, the ladder creaking with each shift of his weight. As his head rose above the level of the deck, the first details of the greeting party came into focus. 3 men in heavy work clothes, their faces impassive, each holding a length of steel pipe or a hooked pole. It wasn't the welcome of a friendly crew. The man in the center stepped forward as Marcus swung onto the deck. He was tall, lean, his hair shaved close, and his eyes sharp and colorless. "You have 1 hour," he said, his accent difficult to place, the words delivered without warmth. He jerked his head toward the aft section of the deck. "The captain will see you later. For now, stay where you are told." Marcus nodded, keeping his expression neutral. "We appreciate your cooperation," he said evenly, gesturing toward the horizon as if to remind them of their pretext. "Our readings are best taken near the outer stacks." The man gave no reply, simply turning and setting off at a brisk pace along the narrow passageway between two towering walls of containers. The metal walls loomed over them, blotting out most of the sunlight and turning the air into a stagnant corridor of salt and rust. They followed deeper into the ship's labyrinth, the path winding past blocks of containers that bore no markings. Marcus noted the irregularities in the stacking, gaps where containers should have been, some sitting crosswise as if to form hidden compartments. Here and there, small vents or reinforced doors had been cut into the sides of certain units, modifications no legitimate shipping line would tolerate. The men escorting them moved with a casual watchfulness, their weapons hanging loosely but ready. It was clear that these passageways were not places outsiders were meant to see. Marcus kept his pace steady, scanning every detail without turning his head too sharply. He saw the faint scuff marks on the deck where heavy doors had been dragged open, the subtle scratches in the paint from locks being forced or sealed repeatedly. Aisha, walking just ahead, carried herself as if absorbed in her own purpose, but he knew her sharp eyes were catching the same details. John, hulking behind them, seemed outwardly relaxed, but Marcus could tell by the way his jaw worked that he was storing up every feature of the ship's interior for later. They reached a junction where the containers opened into a narrow cross-deck. The escort in front halted, turning sharply to face Marcus. "Here," he said, "your hour starts now." Without further explanation, he and the others stepped back, their posture making it clear that the visitors were to go no farther without permission. Marcus inclined his head, then turned as if to begin setting up imaginary survey equipment. He crouched beside a container and pretended to study its base, letting his hand trail along the metal until his fingers brushed something cold and slightly loose, a latch. From the corner of his eye he saw movement. A narrow door in the container's side swung inward, and, in an instant, he was pulled inside by unseen hands. The world shifted from glaring daylight to the dim, enclosed space of the container, the air cooler and tinged with the scent of unwashed bodies and recycled breath. Before he could react, the door closed behind him with a muffled thud. In the half-light, figures emerged from the shadows, men and women in worn clothes, their faces lined with fatigue. At their center stood a man Marcus recognized instantly, though he had never met him in person. The high cheekbones, the steady dark eyes, it was the man from the photographs in the recovered container. Dr. Elias Nguema. His gaze was sharp despite the deep hollows beneath his eyes. "You found the message?" Elias said, his voice low but urgent. It was not a question. Marcus nodded once. "We did, and we heard your recording." For a moment, the tension between them eased, a silent acknowledgement passing from one to the other. Elias glanced toward the door, then stepped closer. "This is our chance," he said. "We can't stay here. They will move us again soon, and the next place will be worse." Marcus's eyes adjusted to the gloom and he took in the cramped space more fully. Along the walls, makeshift bunks had been bolted in 2 tiers. The floor was crowded with boxes repurposed as storage, a few cooking pots blackened from use, and a small battery-powered lamp casting a faint yellow light. There were at least 20 people here, perhaps more hidden in the deeper recesses. Their clothes bore the stains of long wear, and their eyes held the wariness of those who had learned to mistrust hope. Elias wasted no time. He spoke quickly, outlining the truth Marcus had suspected but dreaded hearing. The crew of the Althea, if the ship could even be called that, were not legitimate mariners. They were a part of a network that captured skilled scientists and technicians from vessels working in remote waters. The captives were forced into labor aboard, conducting research and monitoring tasks whose ultimate purpose was never explained. They were shifted from one location to another without warning, their containers doubling as both workspace and prison. Resistance was met with swift retaliation. Elias himself had tried to organize a refusal to work, and, in response, the crew had detached his container and dumped it into the sea, assuming it would sink without trace. They didn't know I had sealed the equipment and the recorder, Elias said with a faint, grim smile. I hoped someone like you would find it. Marcus listened, feeling the urgency in the man's words seep into his own resolve. There was no mistaking the stakes now. The people here were not just captives. They were assets to someone's hidden operation, and those who ran this ship had no reason to let them go willingly. The window for action was narrow. They could not storm the vessel with only the three of them, but they could gather information, mark the positions of the containers holding captives, and get word to the Umkhonto to relay coordinates to the Coast Guard units Marcus had preemptively contacted. Aisha moved among the people, checking for injuries with a quiet efficiency, her presence drawing hesitant gratitude from those unused to kindness. John, meanwhile, stood near the door, his bulk an unspoken barrier against interruption. Marcus leaned closer to Elias, lowering his voice. "We will get you out," he said, "but we have to be precise. When we leave here, I'll signal my crew. Help is already moving toward us." The hour allotted to them was slipping away. Marcus felt each minute as a tightening in his chest. He signaled to Aisha and John that it was time. Elias clasped his forearm briefly, a gesture both of trust and of pardon. "We'll be ready," he said simply. Marcus gave a single nod before the hidden door creaked open again. Outside, the escorts stood where they had been, their expressions unreadable. Marcus forced himself to adopt the same professional detachment he had worn when they arrived. "We have the readings we need," he said in an even tone. The lead man gave a curt nod and gestured toward the way they had come. They retraced their steps through the container maze, the oppressive heat returning as the narrow passages funneled the day's sun. The hour had ended, but the mission was only just beginning in truth. Back at the rope ladder, Marcus descended into the launch, the others following in silence. As the small boat pulled away, he allowed himself a final look at the hulking ship. Somewhere behind those steel walls, Elias and the others were waiting. The information they carried in their minds might be as valuable and as dangerous as whatever was hidden in the depths they had been forced to study. By the time they reached the Umkhonto, the plan was already forming in Marcus's mind. The Coast Guard would need exact positions, an assessment of the crew's numbers, and the element of surprise. He intended to give them all three. And when the time came, the Althea would no longer be a phantom ship slipping between jurisdictions. It would be a trap, closing on those who thought themselves beyond the reach of justice. The Umkhonto's engines thrummed low and steady beneath Marcus's feet as he stood in the wheelhouse, gazing out across the heaving water toward the vanishing silhouette of the impostor Althea. The early light had softened to a gray haze, and the ship's bulk was already dissolving into it, a phantom once more. But Marcus carried its shape in his mind. Mapped in memory now, the container stacks, the narrow passages, the hidden door that had led him to Elias and the others. Every detail had been imprinted on him because he knew that soon they would be going back. Not as guests under watchful eyes, but with the full force of law and a plan designed to bring the whole operation down in one swift, irreversible strike. He leaned over the console, double-checking the coordinates and relaying them through a secure channel to the Coast Guard units he had alerted before they had even approached the ship. His message was concise and without flourish. Confirmed location of vessel engaged in unlawful detention of multiple persons, request immediate coordinated interception, will provide visual marking for tactical boarding. He knew the language to use to cut through hesitation, the words that would push this up the chain without delay. On the far end of the channel, the reply came back clipped and certain. Assistance en route, ETA just over an hour. An hour. It would be the longest 60 minutes of his life. The Umkhonto kept its distance from the Althea, trailing her from beyond the visible horizon, the radar keeping her position fixed. Celine monitored their heading from her station, her voice low as she updated Marcus every few minutes. Leon sat with his eyes glued to the drone feeds, ready to deploy one if they needed an aerial perspective. On deck, John moved with a purposeful calm, checking lines, testing the ship's small crane, ensuring everything was ready to secure whatever they might have to take aboard in a hurry. Aisha was in the med bay, laying out supplies and readying stretchers. They all knew what was coming. No one spoke much. They didn't need to. Marcus's mind drifted briefly back to the cramped, shadowed interior of the container where Elias had stood, speaking quietly, but with the urgency of a man who had measured every word against the risk of being overheard. He remembered the faces of the others, some wary, some almost too exhausted to register his presence, and the sudden change in their expressions when they realized help had come. That hope was fragile, and Marcus knew it could shatter as easily as it had appeared if they were not careful now. On the horizon, faint shapes began to emerge, low, fast-moving craft cutting white wakes through the swells. The Coast Guard patrol boats were coming in hard, flanking the Umkhonto's position. Behind them, larger silhouettes took form. A cutter and two auxiliary vessels, their hulls dark against the water. Marcus gave a brief, tight smile. The net was drawing in. He opened the encrypted channel again, this time to coordinate the approach. They would come in from multiple bearings, giving the Althea no clear escape route. The patrol boats would close from ahead and astern, while the cutter would approach broadside with boarding teams ready. Marcus's role would be to act as the visible distraction, coming up on the Althea's beam under the same harmless pretext as before, buying the seconds needed for the faster craft to swarm in. As the final plan was confirmed, Marcus turned the wheel, bringing the Umkhonto onto a direct intercept course. The wind had picked up, and the ship pitched gently, but his hands were steady on the controls. Through binoculars, he could now make out the Althea clearly again, its weather-stained flanks rising and falling with the swell. From this distance, the ship looked inert, unaware of what was coming. They closed the gap with deliberate slowness. Marcus kept the radio chatter casual, asking the Althea's deck watch for a chance to calibrate some readings. The reply was curt, but no suspicion seemed to take root, just the same guarded tone as before. He guided the Umkhonto closer, aware that even now the Coast Guard boats were fanning out beyond the other ship's line of sight, creeping into position. Then, almost imperceptibly at first, the tone of the day shifted. A burst of radio static carried a coded signal from the cutter. Positions locked, moving in. Marcus gave a barely perceptible nod to Celine, who relayed to Leon. The drone operator's hands flew over the controls, sending a compact reconnaissance unit skimming low over the water. It arced toward the Althea, transmitting back sharp, real-time images. Armed crew on the forward deck, 2 men moving near the helm, the rest scattered in watch positions along the container rows. Marcus committed each to memory. The first patrol boat came into view off the Althea's starboard bow, throttling up with a roar. Another appeared aft. By the time the crew of the larger ship began shouting and scrambling toward their stations, the cutter was already bearing down on their port side, its gray flank blotting out the horizon. The boarding teams moved like clockwork, their black-clad figures poring over the rails, weapons at the ready. Orders were barked, sharp and undeniable, the language of authority that brooked no argument. From his vantage point on the Umkontos bridge, Marcus watched the chaos unfold in the narrow spaces between the containers. The Althea's crew had no time to mount a real defense. Within minutes, they were being herded toward the open deck, wrists bound, their weapons confiscated. The shouts died down, replaced by the metallic clink of handcuffs and the low murmur of Coast Guard officers relaying status reports. Marcus eased the Umkonto closer until they were nearly alongside, then crossed over with John and Aisha once given the all-clear. The heat between the container stacks was stifling, but they moved quickly, following the route Marcus had memorized. It was easier now, the path cleared of hostile eyes, though the air still carried the same oppressive weight as before. They reached the modified container and found the hidden door unlatched. Inside, the captives were already rising from their bunks, drawn by the sound of unfamiliar voices and the thud of boots on the deck outside. Elias was at the forefront, his expression a mix of disbelief and relief as he saw Marcus step through the doorway. "It's over," Marcus told him, his voice carrying enough certainty to make it real. Around them, the others began to stir, their fatigue breaking under the first rush of freedom. Aisha moved quickly, assessing those who needed immediate attention, while John coordinated with the boarding team to begin transferring the freed captives to the cutter. Marcus stayed with Elias for a moment longer, steadying him as they stepped out into the sunlight. The glare made them both squint, but Marcus saw something shift in the man's bearing, a weight lifting, replaced by the raw, unsteady lightness of someone who has been caged too long. The evacuation took time. Stretcher cases went first, followed by those able to walk with assistance. The Coast Guard medics moved with efficiency, born of training, their crisp voices guiding the process. Marcus oversaw the line of freed captives as they crossed to safety, making sure each one was accounted for. Only when the last of them was aboard the cutter did he allow himself to exhale fully. By late afternoon, the Althea was under full Coast Guard control, her sullen crew locked in the brig, her bridge sealed. The freed captives had been given bunks, water, and food on the cutter, with arrangements already being made to bring them to shore where temporary shelters and medical care awaited. The story was already beginning to travel along the maritime channels. An unregistered vessel seized, human lives saved from forced captivity. Marcus knew it would hit the wider media soon, and that was fine. The world needed to know. Back aboard the Umkonto, as the convoy began its slow journey toward the nearest port, Marcus stood at the rail, watching the wake stretch behind them in a long, foaming trail. The day's work had ended as well as it could have, but in his mind, questions still churned. He thought of the charts in Elias's container, the marked points near the trench, and the research they had been forced to conduct. Whatever the ship's masters had been looking for was still out there in the depths, untouched by today's victory. That would be a battle for another day. For now, he allowed himself the smallest measure of peace. The people they had set out to find were safe. Justice had taken a tangible form in steel and uniforms, and the locked cuffs on the wrists of those who had believed themselves untouchable. The Althea was no longer a phantom, and though the ocean would keep her secrets a little while longer, Marcus knew they had taken the first step toward uncovering them, and that, for today, was enough. Don't forget to subscribe, check out our next and other videos, and share this one with your friends.